I'm Brian Mork. I work here with the Forest Service. I'm the Assistant Fire Management Officer for the Tongass and one of the chapter members here. So just wanted to kick it off this morning. Glad you're all here. Weather is it's still a beautiful day in Sitka. So yeah, you got some good weather while you're here. And just to go over the agenda a bit, we've got myself facilitating in the morning. We'll have several presentations, and we'll also have the Growing for the Future Sustainable Wood Utilization, and that's gonna be a panel with Matt LeBrins, Darren McAvoy, and Priscilla Morris. And I'll talk to Jeremy whether he's facilitating that or I am during the break. But then we'll have lunch on our own, and then it'll be turning over to Greg in the afternoon. And don't forget our banquet tonight for those who registered at the Coldwater Bar and Grill, which is right over there next to the Westmark Sciatica. Okay, and for those online, we'd like to give a special welcome to anyone new on Zoom that's joining us. If you wouldn't mind, we're having better bandwidth today, but if anyone new today on Zoom could turn on their camera and give a little introduction. I see a few new folks. Bob's, would you mind coming on?
Yeah, I'm Bob Dalrymple. I live in Wrangell and I'm happy to participate. Couldn't make it over there to Sitka in person, but I'm enjoying this Zoom. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. And then who else would we have up there that might not have got introduced? Everyone else is on. Okay, everyone else is on. Thanks, Todd. Okay, well, getting into the agenda here, we'll have presentation here shortly, but sticking with the theme, back to this future for self-sustainability. Got a little trivia question to get your minds engaged, and we've got either a prize of chocolate or Force or Fun raffle ticket. So if anyone can tell me who Marty McFly posed as in Back to the Future to convince George to ask Lorraine to the dance, you have a choice of chocolate bar, raffle. Sure. So he posed as someone scary. Darth Vader. Oh, all right, Ed Morgan. Oh, okay. All right, what would you like? What would you like? A chocolate bar or raffle ticket? It's a chocolate bar. All right, you're going for the instant. All right. Congratulations. Yeah, Darth Vader. So with the theme Back to the Future, something that's been we're all learning about is the effects of climate change on U.S. forests. And this morning we've got the pleasure of Chris Fettig being with us. And Chris, you're gonna come up, and if you give a little introduction about yourself, and we look forward to the presentation.
Yeah, well, Brian, thanks for that very brief introduction there. I do want to thank everyone for the opportunity to contribute here today. I checked, and the last time I had an opportunity to speak at an AKSAF was in 2019, actually on a very similar topic, but we've learned a lot since then. Do want to apologize for not being there in person. I had all intent to do so. In fact, I had this very elaborate plan to go from field research near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, to a speaking engagement in Missoula, Montana, and then directly from Missoula to Sitka. But then we got our budget numbers for the year, and I just wasn't able to facilitate any of that. So I actually haven't left my house in the last 10 days. Can we get the next slide, please?
Just a minute.
There we go. Okay, so I thought I'd, and there's a lot of names in the room there I'm not familiar with. I've only think I've met a small sub portion of you, so I thought I'd spend a second introducing myself. As indicated earlier, my name is Chris Fettig. I am a research entomologist here at the Pacific Southwest Research Station, kind of classically trained as a forest entomologist with an undergraduate degree in forestry and advanced degrees in entomology. Most of my personal research program focuses on forest health and disturbance ecology. So things like bark beetles, climate change, wildfire, their interactions. I hold courtesy appointments at several universities, sit on the editorial boards of forests, Forest Ecology and Management, Forest Science, which, as many of you know, is SAF's scholarly journal, as well as the Journal of Economic Entomology. And for the last 3.5 years or so, I've had the distinct honor and privilege of serving as a federal coordinating lead author for the 5th National Climate Assessment, which informs climate management and policy here in the United States. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So I can see that. So I've got a lot of information I'm going to share with you this morning. I'm going to try to run through this as quickly as possible. I do want to spend a little bit of time providing some background information on climate change, a little bit on the 5th National Climate Assessment, spend the bulk of my time on the effects of climate change on forests in the United States, drawing many of my inferences from the forest chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment. Spend a little bit of time on adaptation, use as an excuse to update you on our work on spruce beetle repellents in Alaska. This has been a collaborative effort between my research station, Forest Health Protection in Region 10, as well as the Alaska Division of Forestry and Fire Protection and a company known as Iskatech. And then hopefully have leave a few minutes at the end there to entertain any questions you might have. Next slide. So I'm sure most of you in the room are quite familiar that the vast majority of the Earth's surface has warmed during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. What you may not know is that most of that warming has actually occurred in the Northern Hemisphere at mid to high latitudes and often at mid to high elevations. And that's one of the reasons I've always argued that we in Western North America were kind of ground zero for looking at the effects of climate change on natural systems over time. It's where we detected some of the initial increases in temperature, and we've now observed some of the largest increases in temperature. The other important point is that these temperature increases tend to be much greater in winter than in summer, and they tend to be manifested as an increase in the minimum, or what we call the nighttime low temperature. Next slide. The other point I often like to make is that it's not only getting warmer, it's getting warmer faster. In fact, if you look at the data since 2000, 22 of the 23 warmest years on record have occurred, the exception being 1998. The 10 warmest years on record have all occurred in the last 10 years. The warmest, 2023, 1.2 degrees Celsius above that long-term mean. Next slide. Most of that warming, as I'm sure you're aware, is attributed to the radiative properties of carbon dioxide, but there are other greenhouse gases that are also quite important. Things like methane, nitrous oxide, halocarbons. Methane, for example, is one of the most potent greenhouse gases, but it has a very short residence time, somewhere in the order of 9 to 10 years. Just to put CO2 into perspective, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we believe atmospheric concentrations were near stable, somewhere around 270 parts per million. Today, if you flip on your iPhone and check, we're probably somewhere around 425, projected to go to 550 by mid-century, and perhaps to surpass 700 parts per million by the end of this century alone. In fact, if you do the math, since 1751, we've released about 400 billion metric tons of carbon into the environment, half of that since the 1980s, most of that associated with our consumption of fossil fuels. by the transportation and energy sectors, as well as cement production. And years ago, I took a little dive into the life cycle of cement, of all things. Very interesting. Cement is actually the second most consumed substance on Earth by humans after water. As best I can tell, a very energy costive process. You essentially need to heat calcium to 2000 degrees Celsius. And when you do that, for every pound of cement you produce, you release about a pound of carbon into the environment. That figure on the top right is just showing emissions over time. You can see China is by far the largest polluter. We're number two there. A lot of people will argue we're number one on a per capita basis. We are not. Much smaller countries tend to be, countries like Qatar, Palau. The other point I just wanted to make there is you can see that the United States and the EU have really made some ground in terms of curbing our emissions in the last several years. And that's something I think we don't give due attention to. Next slide. I just want to switch now to the National Climate Assessment. Again, I don't know how familiar many of you are with this document. I would very strongly encourage you to check it out. I'll provide the link here in a second. But the legislative origins are in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 that actually states that no less frequently than every 4 years, we shall prepare and submit to the President and Congress an assessment, which does a lot of different things. Perhaps most importantly, analyze the effects of global change on the natural environment, agriculture, energy production and use, land and water resources, transportation, human systems, as well as biodiversity. And also, there was a strong physical component to these assessments, calling for analyzing current trends in change and actually projecting future change for the next 25 to 100 years. Next slide, please. The most recent National Climate Assessment, the fifth National Climate Assessment, we wrapped up in November. It was released by President Biden on the morning of November 14th. And at the same time, he called for more significant investments to strengthen climate resilience across the country. Next slide. This is the table of contents from the fifth National Climate Assessment. So you can see we have two chapters that focus on the physical science. We have national or what I like to call topical chapters. You can see one of them focuses on forest. We'll be drawing a lot of inference from that this morning. There are regional chapters, and the regional chapter also focuses on Alaska. Next slide. Much stronger language in the fifth National Climate Assessment compared to the fourth National Climate Assessment, which I also contributed to as a co-author. Here, language like it's now unequivocal that human activities have increased atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. It is also unequivocal that global average temperature has risen in response, and that the impacts of climate change increase with warming, and warming will continue if emissions of CO2 do not reach net zero. Again, much, much stronger language than we've seen in any earlier assessments. Picture there on the left is just a cover from the fifth National Climate Assessment, and I'm providing the website there. Again, I encourage you to go there, check it out. There's a tremendous amount of resources. Everything is freely downloadable, including all the figures as well as the metadata. Next slide. This just shows you observed changes in temperature on the left and precipitation on the right. These are expressed as differences between the present day, defined here as 2002 through 2021, compared to the average of the first half of the last century. So again, if you look at temperatures, you can see significant warming throughout most of the United States, particularly here in the West at mid to high latitudes, mid to high elevations, and concentrated in winter. In reference to Alaska specifically, Alaska is warming faster than the rest of the United States and 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. On the right, again, precipitation, you can see significant changes in precipitation across the country, increases, for example, throughout much of the northeastern United States, reductions in precipitation, unfortunately for us here in the Southwest. Next slide. These are just some of the observed effects in Alaska. I'm sure you're quite aware with a lot of these things. We've seen rapid, widespread, extreme events in terms of warming of air, soil, ocean temperatures. We've seen record low sea ice. We've seen the world's highest rate of ocean acidification, and obviously significant increases in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. The figure there on the right comes from Chapter 29 of the 5th National Climate Assessment, if anybody's interested. It's just showing some of these major ecological changes that I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. Maybe two of the more notable ones from the forest sector are obviously the expansion of white spruce populations, as well as the spruce beetle outbreak in South Central Alaska that I'll comment on a little bit here in the future. Next slide. These those things I just talked about were observed. These are projected changes in temperature for the US. And here, just looking at various levels of global warming. So you can pick your poison here. As an example, I'm just looking at C, kind of an average level of global warming, somewhere on the order of about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. But you can see what that would mean for the United States. And particularly, you can see what that would mean for the state of Alaska here. Much higher levels. In fact, somewhere on the order of 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit for much of Alaska, exclusive of some of the southeastern coastal regions. Next slide, please. And then this is a very similar diagram just for precipitation. A little bit more noise in these data. Again, let's just use C as an example there, with average global warming somewhere on the order of about 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, projections here for much of the United States is that we'll see increases in precipitation, and that's really exacerbated, as you can see, in the state of Alaska, somewhere on the order of increases of somewhere between perhaps 10 and 20%. Next slide, please. So this takes us to the actual Chapter 7 of the 5th National Climate Assessment, which focuses on forests exclusively. As I mentioned earlier, I was the federal coordinating lead author, and I managed this process in collaboration with the chapter lead, Grant Domke, who many of you may know. He's a research forester with FIA out of the Northern Research Station. He's kind of the carbon guru for the country. Next slide. We start off with just kind of talking about the importance of forests here in the United States. I probably don't need to do much of this for people in this room. We're all very passionate and connected to forests, but we do acknowledge that forests provide immense ecological, economic, and social goods and services, that they represent over a third of the land base here in the US, and that they actually contribute pretty significantly to the US manufacturing GDP. We also discussed that the vulnerability of forests across the country really vary quite a bit due to differences in biophysical conditions, as well as local and regional variations in climate and climate change. Next slide, please. We have three key messages within the forest chapter. The first is that forests are increasingly affected by climate change and climate-related disturbances, and that continued warming and regional changes in precipitation are expected to amplify interactions among disturbance agents, things like bark beetles and wildfire, which I'll talk about here in a moment, and further alter forest ecosystem structure and function at very large scales here in the US. Next slide. Thought I'd talk a little bit about bark beetles. We heard some yesterday from Jesse about the spruce beetle. These are poikothermic insects. So as you can appreciate, shifts in temperature and precipitation can affect about everything in their life history. So for example, their fecundity and fitness, phenology and volatinism simply being the number of generations produced per unit time. I'll share examples of those with you here in a moment. But not only the beetles themselves, predators, parasites, competitors, other symbionts within these systems. It affects their ability to find and successfully colonize host trees, because it also affects things like host tree physiology and the ability of trees to resist colonization by bark beetles over time. Kind of the classic work in the field is depicted here on the right. This is a paper we published in Bioscience all the way back in 2010. And anybody wanting more information on this topic, I would encourage you to take a look at that document. Next slide, please. The figure here on the left, I like to use as just kind of an average depiction of an average bark beetle life cycle. So it begins on the very top there with what we call a pioneering beetle. They initiate host selection and colonization. And what they do is they kind of navigate the forested landscape, find these hosts, land on the host, they test the host. If they accept the host, they bore into the host. Healthy hosts respond with the production of this pitch. And in many times, that's sufficient to encapsulate that pioneering individual and kill it. And the attack may end right there. And the tree may live for decades, if not centuries. But if the beetles are successful, eventually mating occurs, egg laying occurs, and they run through their life cycle. And depending on the bark beetle species, tree species, abiotic conditions, other factors, this life cycle may be repeated once every several years, as is the case with spruce beetle in our high elevation forests, or several times an individual year, as is the case with something like western pine beetle in our ponderosa pine forest here in the state of California. Next slide, please.
So,
There we go. Thank you. So this I just provided to give you a kind of an average depiction of the area impacted by the bark beetles in the U.S. Time series here 2000 through 2020. The top portion of that figure is the western U.S. The bottom is the southern United States, or really the eastern United States. The only major bark beetle species in the east is the southern pine beetle. Populations there have been at record lows for decades now. In fact, in my opinion, southern pine beetle has become functionally extinct in many areas where it was the dominant forest disturbance, and we don't really know why yet. On the top there in the west, we've seen record highs. You can see the gorilla in the room there is represented by that orange line. That is mountain pine beetle. Populations here in the western United States peaked in 2009 when 3.7 million hectares were impacted by that insect that year alone. All the other important bark beetles here in the west are represented by that blue line. You can see two distinct peaks there. One in about 2004, that driven by spruce beetle activity, and then one in 2016, that driven by western pine beetle and fir activity, largely here in the state of California. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a moment. To put these numbers into perspective, wildfires nationwide burn on average about 3 million hectares, and therefore most years, if not many years, tree losses attributed to bark beetles actually often exceed that of wildfires here in the US. Next slide, please. So with climate change in general, we've seen an intensification of bark beetle outbreaks and their impacts, again, here in the western United States. In fact, if I consider the data as a whole, I come up with what I call 4 grand champions. These are bark beetle outbreaks of a magnitude and or extent we really hadn't seen in at least recorded history, if not paleo history. So the first I have listed here is this very large mountain pine beetle outbreak, really throughout most of Western North America, including Western Canada. Several different hosts involved. The inciting factor here is an increase in temperature, but specifically winter temperatures, which have allowed a higher portion of the brood to survive the winter and contribute to the next generation. That's been particularly important at higher latitudes and higher elevations. Just to put this mountain pine beetle outbreak into perspective, it's really quite incredible. Since 2000, greater than 27 million hectares have been impacted. To put that into perspective, that's an area larger than our 11 smallest states, South Carolina on down combined. Second one I have listed here, you're all quite familiar with. This is the spruce beetle outbreak on the Kenai Peninsula in the late 1990s there, where that beetle was essentially almost responsible for killing all susceptible Lutz spruce. Again, there the inciting factor is an increase in temperature, but specifically summer temperatures allowed a portion of that population to go from a 2-year life cycle to a 1-year life cycle. And you can imagine the implications of that to population dynamics over time. The next one I have listed here is this record western pine beetle outbreak in the central and southern Sierra Nevada. There, the inciting factor, this interaction between elevated temperatures and reductions in precipitation, as expressed through increases in host susceptibility to colonization by the beetle at a landscape level. I'll talk more about that here in a second as an example. And then a very similar situation in the southwestern US in our pinyon pine forest with a bark beetle known as pinyon ips. Next slide, please. We've also, with climate change, seen shifts in geographic and host ranges. Probably the most notable is mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle populations in interior British Columbia literally got so large that they got lifted into the active airstream and deposited on the other side of the continental divide for the first time in recorded history. They landed in a lodgepole pine forest, one of their primary hosts. They did quite well. From there, they entered this zone of hybridization between lodgepole pine and jack pine, a naive host, a host the beetle has never seen before. They were successful reproducing in those trees. They now have been documented reproducing in pure jack pine. And this is a concern because perhaps the beetle could use kind of that jack pine land bridge to get across northern North America into the northeastern United States and eventually into the southeast, where we have significant pine resources at risk. This is a great example of what I like to call a native going invasive. Next slide, please. But we've also seen a similar issue in the Northeast with southern pine beetle. To put this in context, southern pine beetle is native to the state of New Jersey. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but they are native to the state of New Jersey, generally at very low densities, often undetectable. But they were detected for the first time in New York in 2014, Connecticut 2015, Massachusetts 2015, and most recently in Maine in 2001. Again, we believe this to be facilitated by climate change, specifically warming during winter. Next slide, please. And then we've seen changes in pest status. This is just kind of a crude example. The northern spruce engraver, Ips perturbatus. This is something we were working on several years ago in interior Alaska. To put this into perspective, many of you are familiar that the agency puts together these forest insect and disease leaflets for the major forest insect pests. The first was western pine beetle. We did one on northern spruce engraver back in 2011. It was number 180 in that series. Wasn't really on many people's radar as a major forest insect pest. It's becoming one and will become more of one in the future due to drought stress precipitated by climate change. Next slide, please. And what I thought I'd talk a little bit now is something a little closer to here because I think it's a great bellwether event for what we're going to see more frequently at larger scale throughout much of the Western US. And this is something I call the California tree mortality event. To put it into perspective, our state came out from 5 years of consecutive drought in 2017. To put the drought into perspective, water year 2015 was the hottest and driest on record. 2014 wasn't very far behind. It was the third driest and second warmest. We now have data from tree ring reconstructions that suggest that this drought event was likely the most significant in about a 1200-year chronology. On the right there, just the drought monitor for California, late October 2016. You can see the area represented by extreme and exceptional drought, pretty significant throughout much of the state. And then you can see what the drought monitor looks like in April 2017 following a near record winter. Next slide. So in 2015, our aerial detection survey first started to report extensive levels of tree mortality. In that year, they suggested somewhere on the order about 29 million trees had been killed. As a result, the governor at the time, Jerry Brown, declared a state of emergency and established a task force to help address the issue. I served on the governor's task force for several years. To date now, about 150 million trees have been killed, most of them in 2016. Next slide, please. As a result of that activity, our lab built what we call the California Tree Mortality Network, a network of 180 plots across 4 national forests, 3 different elevational bands, where we have every tree monumented and we measure about everything you legally can on a tree. We visited these trees on an annual basis since 2016, including the COVID years. And what we're really chasing after here is just change over time. You can see we're looking at a lot of different variables here. For example, effects on seedling saplings and trees, but also how the fuel profiles are changing over time, snag demography, carbon, pollinators, wood borers, you name it, we're kind of looking at it. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show you how rapidly some of these changes can occur with some of these events. So this is just one of our study sites, relatively low elevation on the Sierra National Forest. On the left is what that stand looked like in 2014. On the right, 2016. We went from 200 trees per acre down to 60, from 183 square feet of basal area per acre down to 13. We went from a forest that was dominated by large diameter ponderosa pine to one where there was a few incense cedar and canyon live oak left. And if you do the math, in a period of about 2 years, we lost 70% of the trees, 93% of the basal area, 94% of the volume. All the ponderosa pine were colonized and killed by western pine beetle during that exceptional drought event. Next slide, please. Overall, across the entire network, we lost about 50% of the trees. Ponderosa pine exhibited the highest levels of tree mortality. We lost about 90% of the ponderosa pine. 40% of those 180 plots lost all their ponderosa pine. We lost about 90% of the ponderosa pine in the 3 largest diameter classes, that representing obviously a very an important structural variable within these forests. We lost about 50% of the sugar pine, most of those colonized by mountain pine beetle. And we lost about 25% of the white fir and incense cedar. And even under this extreme drought event, we found that tree mortality was positively correlated with initial live tree density. Again, just a measure of the amount of competition in a forest system. We could choose to do something about that at much larger spatial scales. Next slide, please. From there, we went on and to do some really fancy modeling to look at the direct effects of warming on the beetle itself. And so I know the figure on the right is kind of complicated, but if you look at the top right there, what we're showing is that we see an increase in volatilism. Again, the number of generations produced per unit time during the drought period compared to the contemporary period. Just means more beetles out there actively searching and colonizing trees. On the bottom left of that figure, we also saw a significant reduction in overwintering mortality. While statistically significant, I don't argue it's very important in this system. You can see this is not a very cold environment. On average, we're looking at mortality rates somewhere in the single digits. I don't think that's very important. But when you do the math, we now attribute about 30% of that increase in tree mortality to the direct effects of warming on the beetle itself, the other 70% to the indirect effects of warming and reductions in precipitation as expressed through large increases in the vulnerability of trees to colonization by the beetle. Next slide, please. And then just recently, we released this paper. It's gotten quite a bit of attention, where our modeling suggests that the amount of carbon stored in ponderosa pine prior to the California tree mortality event will at least not return throughout the 21st century due to continued warming and bark beetle outbreaks. It's pretty interesting. I think what to me is a little bit more interesting, something I'm showing here on the right, that for about each degree Celsius increase in temperature, we expect the number of trees killed by western pine beetle in the Sierra Nevada to increase somewhere between 25 and 40%. So again, just showing that interaction between warming and reductions in precipitation here and how it's going to be influencing our forests in the future. And I think that's something we'll see more across much of the West. Next slide, please. Shifting from bark beetles to wildfire, a lot of good data here as well. We know that climate change has increased the frequency of large fires, increased the length of the wildfire season in some areas by up to 90 days, increased the area burned, increased the area burned at high severity as well as other severity classes. And more recently now, we're actually able to tease out that we're seeing an increase in the proportion of area burned at high severity. That's at least true for the Southwest, but I think we'll see that occur in many other portions of the country as well in the near future. Next slide. This is just some modeling we did and included in Chapter 7 of the 5th National Climate Assessment. This is looking at changes in weather conditions conducive to very large fires, defined here as greater than 12,000 acres in size. So on the left is the historical condition. On the right is the projected condition. You can see some pretty significant increases in here, specifically for the upper Great Lakes. Orders of change somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000%. But you can also see there are other areas of the country that really don't change. For example, the northeastern United States, we're just not going to see conditions in that area conducive to very large fires. Next slide, please. These are just some data I thought I'd share with you comparing California and Alaska. Here in the state of California, 8 of the 10 largest wildfires in state history, 1850, have occurred since 2017. The climate change signal we're obviously dealing with here in California is increased temperatures and reduced precipitation, particularly during winter. A little bit more noise in the Alaska data, but we are seeing very similar trends. Of course, your climate change signal throughout the state is increased temperatures, but throughout much of the state is also increased precipitation. So again, a little bit more noise here. But in Alaska, 9 of 20 million acre plus fire seasons since 1950 have occurred since 2000. Next slide, please. And the other point I wanted to make is that these disturbances don't interact in isolation, right? They contribute to one another. This is just a photo series from one of our studies in Colorado. I could show you multiple examples of this, but just to put this into perspective, on the left there is a picture I took in one of our plots in the state of Colorado following a mountain pine beetle outbreak that peaked in terms of numbers of tree mortality in 2009, that photo being taken in 2012. A lot of growing space release. You can see what took advantage of it. A picture of the invasive weed response in 2018. And then a few years later, you can see what that individual plot looks like in 2022 following a high severity wildfire. Again, just indications of these compound disturbances affecting the behavior of each individual disturbance over time. Next slide, please. So the second key message within the forest chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment is that climate change affects ecosystem services provided by forests, and that future climate effects will interact with societal changes to determine the capacity of forests to provide ecosystem services. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I thought I'd just share 2 or 3 examples here. The first, looking at particulate matter 2.5. This is increasing, particularly in CONUS, directly attributed to that increase in the wildfire signal that I discussed earlier. If you're not familiar with particulate matter 2.5, it is linked to declines in human health conditions. And we're talking very small particles here. That's depicted on the right. So we're talking about particles 2.5 or smaller in microns. To compare that, the human hair is somewhere in the order of 50 to 70 microns in diameter. Next slide, please. And then here just showing how important forests are in actually capturing our economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions. On average, our forests here in the US offset those values by about 13 to 14%, but we're starting to see slippage. And most of that slippage is a decline in the carbon sink strength on public forests here in the West due to increases in disturbances associated with climate change like fire, insects, and drought. That data can be a little confusing, so I just thought I'd stress that y-axis, those are negative values, which indicate a sink strength. So as you go closer to the top of that figure, you can see pretty significant decline in that sink strength on public forests here, largely in the West. Next slide, please. And then finally, that third key message is that adaptation actions are necessary for maintaining resilient forest ecosystems here in the United States. And that proactive adaptation of management strategies that create, maintain, and restore resilient forest ecosystems are critical to maintaining the equitable provisioning of ecosystem services that we expect many of our forests to provide to us in perpetuity over time. Next slide, please. A lot of confusion about the terms mitigation and adaptation. I kind of think were relatively well defined, but they are confusing and they just haven't gained all that much traction. But this is simply just a great example of adaptation, right? This goes back to the movie Jaws. You're going to need a bigger boat. Perhaps in the forest sector, forest engineers may argue in Alaska with the climate change signal you're dealing with, you're going to need a bigger culvert. But that's adaptation, not specifically climate adaptation, but adaptation. Next slide, please. A lot of tools out there for you. Been a proliferation of adaptation guides and framework. A lot of information available online. There's a climate change adaptation library. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. And there's information with links directly for the state of Alaska. Next slide, please. Also, the U.S. climate hubs are a great resource as well. I'd encourage you to take a look at those, particularly the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. Just wanted to run through a very few examples here of adaptations. So if the effect is longer wildfire seasons and an increased area burn, like we talked about earlier, an adaptation response may be to thin forests and conduct prescribed and cultural burns to reduce the risk of high severity wildfire at meaningful scales. Next slide, please. Just another example here, if the effect is that we have species on the landscape or genotypes that are maladapted to current or future climates, well, the response may be to plant genotypes or species considered to be more tolerant of those climate conditions, as well as the associated changing disturbance regimes. Next slide, please. I thought I'd use that as an excuse just to update everybody on our work concerning the development of an effective repellent for spruce beetle in Alaska. Next slide. Jesse, I think it was, talked yesterday a little bit about the current outbreak. I thought I'd put it in perspective here as well. About 2 million acres have been impacted since 2016. Most of that in South Central Alaska. This is obviously the first large-scale outbreak since the 1990s, the one I was talking about earlier as one of those 4 grand champions. That was about 2.9 million acres in extent. And as Jesse talked about yesterday, recent observations placed the northern extent of the outbreak in the Alaska range. I do think some of her comments may have suggested that spruce beetle is not endemic to interior Alaska. Spruce beetle is endemic to interior Alaska. It's just not a major disturbance in interior Alaska. And then the bottom right there, that's a true or false question for you. The outbreak has gotten so bad that spruce beetles are now attacking banana trees on the Kenai. The answer, I think, is false because I'm not aware of any banana trees growing on the Kenai, not yet, probably not for this century. But I can tell you there are spruce beetles attacking bananas on the Kenai, and there's an example of 2 of them on the right. Next slide, please. Our work in Alaska draws from our experiences with developing a somewhat similar product known as Splat Verb. It's another bark beetle repellent. Our research brought this to market back in 2013. It was first registered with the US EPA in 2013, first used commercially in 2014. One of the very desirable aspects of this product is that it biodegrades in a period of 1 year. This initially developed for mountain pine beetle and lodgepole pine here in the West. It's also effective for mountain pine beetle and sugar pine, mountain pine beetle and white bark pine, which has obviously become quite important because I'm sure, as many of you know, white bark pine is now a T&E species. Next slide, please. Just some examples here now showing some of the other uses of Splat Verb, ranging from coffee bean borer to rodents to ambrosia beetles. Next slide, please. This is just some of the very recent data from our work on spruce beetle in Alaska, showing high levels of efficacy. So on the far left there is the baited control. We lost 94% of those trees. And all those other treatments are repellent treatments. And you can see on average, we've only lost about 3% of those across those different treatments. Those are individually treated trees. On the right, we're showing data for all spruce in 10th acre circular plots surrounding those treated trees. And again, very promising results there. Within those kind of halos, as I like to describe them, surrounding those treated trees, we lost somewhere in the order of 26% of the trees, but much, much, much lower rates than that in all of these different repellents. So I would argue we're very close to being able to deliver an effective product. Next slide, please. This is just an indication as to what these look like. This is Splat MCH on the left, again, modeled after Splat Verb that we brought to market several years ago. Next slide. And just mention that yesterday, our most recent paper on this was released in the Journal of Economic Entomology, if anybody's interested in taking a look at it. Next slide. And then finally, just wanted to remind everybody that we already have begun work on the 6th National Climate Assessment, and we'll be looking at authorships come later this year. There will be an announcement. You can actually self-nominate if there's anybody interested in contributing. Next slide, which I think is the final one. Yeah, just want to wrap up here. Again, thank you for the invitation. Leave you with my contact information. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Couple of resources there. You can go on Google Scholar and find all my publications, download them for free, and then the very large number of co-authors for this presentation. Thank you. And I'll answer any questions if we have a few minutes, maybe.
Got time for a couple of questions. We'll take them from online or in person here and pass around the mic. Okay, here. And make sure to introduce yourself.
This is Jeremy Dowse with Division of Forestry and Fire Protection. Good presentation, Chris. Appreciate it. Is that Splat? Is that kind of an application that's really designed just for individual trees? Is that the idea there?
I think I couldn't quite hear the end. So, was the question in reference to individual trees? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Is it something that's really designed for application like landscaping trees?
Yeah.
Individual?
Yeah. So right now, it is applied only by hand and at various spatial scales. So probably the largest scale we use Splat Verb at is somewhere in the order of 200 to 300 acres. So we are in the West treating campgrounds on the order of 200 to 300 acres. That would kind of be the extreme case. There's been some discussion about how can we move to even larger spatial scales? Can we use aerial application? Can we use something like drones? I've been trying to keep that at arm's length, particularly for our uses here in the West, because I think most of the material would get hung up in the crown and not get near the bowl where we need the highest concentrations of verbenone to successfully manipulate beetle behavior. I am arguing we are doing work in Germany with their major bark beetle pests. And generally what happens there, which is similar to what used to happen with our spruce beetle, is you used to take a large blowdown event. They'd colonize that compromised material and then emerge and colonize the healthy forest, right? Well, here in that type of situation in Europe, I think with those horizontal substrates, drone applications might actually work. So I'm hoping to put together the resources and to look at that and get a student to help with that starting next year. But we would start with that work in Germany on a different species.
Thank you. It's cutting edge. And we have one more from the room before we go to online.
Hi, Chris. This is from Alaska. Has Splat been tested in Alaska, like in the interior, or have you gotten to that point yet?
No. So the only places we've been testing Splat, so Splat MCH, we originally developed for another bark beetle species, Douglas fir beetle, here in the West. And so we've tested it and it works very well in states like Idaho, Utah, and New Mexico. We have tested splat MCH in the state of Alaska, but all that work has been either done by Denali State, the furthest north, Denali State Park, and most of it recently is around Turn Lake on the Kenai.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll be having the chat that is available for questions if there are any, but don't see any online right now, so we'll move on and give a round of applause